Hi, I'm Garbreak1, and this is Midgardia's cool crowdfunding show. I'm here today with Kibbles Tasty. How's it going?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me, and I'm looking forward to talking about it.
So why don't you tell us a little bit about Kibbles Compendium of Craft and Creation?
So this is going to be a collection of probably three of my most popular systems. I've made stuff online for D&D 5e for about 3 years now, a little more than that. And what I got started with was a alternate artificer. What was originally just the artificer. I was originally somewhat based on, the ideas from the originally scrapped Unearthed Arcana artificer. I kind of salvaged some stuff from that, but over time it kind of developed into its own thing and became fairly popular. It's still probably my most popular class. And so for a long time, people have kind of asked, are you ever going to print this or something? And for a long time, the answer was no, not really, because this was just something I did on the side. But over time, as I got more and more stuff, I added the scion to the roster of classes I make. In addition to the alternate artificer, now what's going to be the inventor in this book. Um, and then just this fall, I guess I started posting my crafting system, which has proved to be probably my second or third most popular thing. So I kind of just grabbed these three things that were vaguely tied together. They're all kind of, artificer and crafting go together pretty well. And then psionics is another kind of semi tied in thing in that it's another intellect based system. And it just is probably one of the bigger missing voids that a lot of people are asking for. Um, I just figured if I'm going to do a Kickstarter, I want to lead with my best foot forward, right? I don't want to try to partition out parts for later and try to save, you know, rate my things by popularity and be like, well, I want to have this one and the next one. So I just figured, well, I'll take my most popular things and I'll put them in a book and I'll see how it goes.
It's been,
And it's gone pretty well. So
yeah.
I can't say I have an expert marketing strategy, but what it is has worked out.
I mean, here's some stuff you want. Works pretty well.
Yeah, there's definitely there's a loose theme to it, and then I guess the things I started packing around once I had those three pillars, like I know that those are going to be the three things in the book. Then I started packing in more thematic related things to get a more consistent experience. So like a lot of the subclasses will be coming for all of the default 5e classes are going to get a subclass that's tied into either inventor or psionics. And a lot of those are made for the book. Some people have seen some of the early drafts of those, like the Tech Knight and things like that before. But a lot of that will be specifically designed for the book once I knew kind of what the book was going to be.
All right, cool. So why don't you tell us a little bit about the Scion?
So the Scion goes pretty far back. It's the second class I made, and the genesis of that class came pretty much directly from the artificer I made. Is that when I made the artificer, people said, "We love this. Are you gonna make psionics?" And I'm like, "No." But if people keep asking, maybe, because I mean, when I made the artificer, it was just something I made. I wasn't really starting my career in homebrew at that point. Um, but I thought about it some, and when the Mystic and things started getting scrapped from their side, I was like, well, there is a need for this. I have psionics in my game. I've always used psionics of some form, but it took me a while because I wasn't really sure I knew what I wanted to do with it. I was always in the kind of camp of I want psionics to not recreate the entire spell system again, which is, I guess, psionics is a very contentious one because everyone's going to come up with their own idea of what psionics are and how they work. Um, so once I kind of had that thought, is that I liked a lot of the things about the Unearthed Arcana Mystic. I liked a lot of things about previous edition psionics, but I also didn't want to go super crazy. And then from that point, I was like, do I have an idea to make a scion? And for a long time, the answer was not so much. But as I kept dealing with, building out the artificer further and getting somewhat better at designing classes, to be honest, um, for 5e especially, I came up with some ideas about how I wanted to convert it. I knew from the start that I wanted to not use spell slots. I wanted to use a point-based system. But that is also complicated because I don't love the spell point variant too much, which is the obvious place to turn, but it is a little bit more conversion and math heavy. For 5e, it's not terrible for me. I mean, I don't mind that personally, but I also try to keep some limitations on how deep down my own rabbit hole I go with that, because I can understand that I am more into the it works technically design rather than super streamlined and slick. So usually my process of making stuff for 5e is taking my ideas that are more mechanically tied to how I want it to work, and then sanding them down a little bit to fit more smoothly into how 5th edition kind of works. So I came up with a key point based system essentially. It didn't quite start as key points, but I realized that we already have that system in the game and it fits pretty nicely into what I want. If you do the math of only giving them warlock like spell levels on short rest, and then you convert those as to one-to-one spell slots into key, you actually get the exact math of the warlock spell slots. Which once I realized that I could basically take elements of the chassis behind monks, elements of the chassis behind warlocks, and kind of combine those into what became the scion. So once I had that flexible point system, I know I needed powers or disciplines, as they're called, and then the part of the benefit of having those points is you can do what I think a lot of people wish the sorcerer did, and have their resources all be kind of unified into one flexible system that goes from empowering their powers, their cantrip like abilities, to casting their more complicated effects, which use a lot of the models from spells to limit that complication I mentioned earlier, but as well as bring a lot of new psionic spells into the system, and some of those spells then can be shared with traditional spellcasters. So it's the compromise that many people are happy with. There's going to be some hardcore fans on one side that say, I want 2e psionics, and this isn't 2e psionics. And then there's going to be some folks on their side that are like, scions should just be sorcerers. What's the difference? But this is kind of, I think, a solid middle ground. It carves out a pretty big chunk of how you can play it. And that's really what's important to me on making classes, is I try to think of how big an umbrella is this? How many different kind of characters can this play? And how many different kind of characters does this add to the roster? And I think with both Inventor and with Scion, the number is very high. This is partially because I go do a bit more of a modular design. So there's a lot more flexibility, and that will make them able to make a lot of different kinds of characters. I mean, especially with the current cultural zeitgeist of various superhero things and Marvel things, you can kind of pull a lot of disparate ideas into 5e of the kind of things you want to play. If you want to play a telekinetic person, or running around with your side blades, or your fantasy take on Iron Man, any of that is kind of all boiled into these. And this isn't really what it's made for, but it's made to include that. It's really made to be character building toolboxes that produce streamlined 5e characters. The character building toolbox is definitely more complicated than the base classes of 5e, but the characters it makes play in a 5e game with traditional 5e streamlined simplicity, I guess, is the goal.
Right, that makes sense.
From the DM side of the screen, if they're just watching a character play, it should feel like any other 5e character. From the player side of the screen, it should feel like whenever you level up, you have choices and options you can apply to making the kind of character you want to play. So I essentially just took that philosophy that already existed in the inventor side, or the alternate artificer, and then I applied that to the scion, and then I applied some of the lessons of things that people liked and didn't like so much. It backs off on the artificer's level restricted upgrades a little bit to have a bit more of an open talent system. And then I really took the whole side point and discipline thing to the logical extreme of making that extremely flexible, but also much more focused than you might see with the Unearthed Kind of Mystic, which had so many different disciplines, it could feel like they were a walking toolbox. I wanted you to use the toolbox to build the character, but not play the toolbox.
Right. And that sounds fantastic. I'm really glad to hear that it's, built off of a marriage of some of the base classes. So, there's that flexibility there, but there are enough elements that you're not learning, 600 new mechanics.
Exactly. And that's kind of the way I do things is I research the bedrock the of how classes are designed. And then I chip pieces off that and I recombobulate them into what I want to use. So I'll find elements from like if you look at the inventor, right, you'll find that under the hood it really is a half caster chassis. It closely matches parts of the paladin and the ranger as like when you're getting your different abilities and so forth. Now there's elements built on top of that and some tweaked to accommodate its upgrade path, but it does have all the base elements of a 5e half caster. And the same thing with the scion, that's where I struggled at first because there's no scion template. But I realized that between the warlock and the monk, we pretty much have what I was looking for that. And then you pull in elements of the sorcerer and can kind of combine things together and it should feel like a 5e class because all the pieces are 5e. It's just they've been expanded and made a little bit more interchangeable, a little bit more modular.
Right. And everybody who says Scion should just be a sorcerer origin is wrong. Uh, that's
I, I,
that's
I
my
can
opinion.
understand where they're coming from to an extent, but I also think that people that are have a more longer legacy with Sonics think that's great, obviously crazy. So it's one of those signs where I think they're not often speaking the same conversation. Where I think obviously psionics are not magic, and to say so is crazy. But I also understand that people that are just coming into it think, well, one is making fire appear out of nothing, the other is making fire appear out of nothing. Shouldn't these be the same thing? I mean, you can certainly use magic to detect thoughts, and you can certainly use telepathy to detect thoughts. So I can see where they might think that those might be the same system. But then again, I mean, I am also big into the I miss the different power sources being a little bit different as well. When we had primal and divine and arcane, to me, psionics is just another pillar like that. Uh, I wish that primal was still around, and that might be something I tackle more in the future. Primal has kind of been folded into divine a little bit in 5e, but I preferred it a little bit more as a little bit more defined on its own. And there's things like the warden or something that could come back with more depth into the primal tree. Now that's leaping ahead of what's in this Kickstarter, but that's just where the mind goes to thinking about the different power sources. I leave psionics a little bit flexible as to what they are in your setting. I'm not here to tell you exactly what psionic power source is, if it interacts with the weave, the magical weave or not. But I do generally imply that psionics come more from within, where magic comes more from manipulate your connection to the weave, not necessarily external power, because like sorcerers, the power is within you to an extent, but it's more how you're tied to the weave of magic, where psionics is more a personal ability that may come from uh, your connection to something, but is more, I guess, internal. I also somewhat relate psionics to ki as not being entirely different. I often treat the monk as a more psionic class, which in previous editions also was a thing.
Right, right. Which makes sense, given that they're both, powers of discipline, I suppose.
Exactly, and I think that a helps integrate psionics into D&D worlds that might not think that they have psionics. If you explain, well, if you have monks, you probably have powers like this anyway. um, and helps expand people's idea of what psionics can be. Right? People think psionics are all spoon bending. Well, that spoon bending is part of psionics, perhaps, but it's a broad umbrella, just like magic's a broad umbrella. So I think that most people would find that their games have psionics if they think about it more. It's just that people are sometimes have a preconceived notion of what psionics are that aren't so much what they have to be.
Right. So, why don't you tell us a little bit about the inventor?
So, as I said, the inventor kind of started from the original Unearthed Arcana Artificer. If you remember way back, Wizards of the Coast published a version of that. And I didn't really have any intention of wandering down the path of making my own class when I started. I just wanted to update what was there to an extent. Um, But over time, things have changed quite a bit from there. The current inventor has no real relation to those roots. That's just kind of what inspired it from the start. But at the same time, you'll see some of the things that that artificer allowed for that have kind of fallen by the wayside a little bit, still present in this. Which is why I think this artificer or this inventor is almost it's not really a competitor to the current version of the artificer that exists, and it can be played in the same game without too much overlap. There's still some places where they'll cover similar themes, but I think that's true of a lot of 5e classes. What the inventor really is all about is letting players take a core concept that they want to approach, and it's kind of reflected in the subclasses, right? You have the gadget smith, who is the most flexible approach to this inventor, where you just have a bag full of tricks, essentially, that can be quite varied and rapidly interchangeable. You can swap them on long rests pretty flexibly. And this will make characters that can fit in all sorts of broad categories, everything from a gadgeteer, which I guess is the typical name for a gadgetsmith, as tells to if you want to go into like make Batman. Sure, you can make Batman. He's got a grappling hook. You can get punching gauntlets. You can get smoke bombs. So it gives you your more generic generic inventor, where you just have a broad skew of different things. You have your thundersmith, which gets people into, they want to make a stick object that shoots projectiles at high speed. And I'm not going to be too fussy about what you want to call it in your D&D setting, but it does lots of damage with things you pointed at. So that this could be your cannonsmith, your gunsmith, the thundersmith is kind of the generic term, because you can even make a hammer out of it. It just does the same thing in melee range of applying large amounts of damage to something. And that kind of bounces around the theme of, so gadgetsmith is a whole bunch of different inventions. You kind of make a bag full of tricks. Or a thundersmith, you focus all of your inventions on making this one thing to perfection. And you just refine your Stormforged weapon, as it's typically referred to, into a very powerful device. And then we, of course, we have, Infusion Smith, which is more the Arcanist version, where you're enchanting different magical items. We have the Golem Smith, where you are putting all of your class features into one very powerful golem that has great capabilities, but leaves you, the character, as a smart guy on the battlefield, standing behind your very cool golem. And that's really, I think, the theme behind the inventor is that it's a very self-made hero. You're not a grand wizard. You do have some spell casting as a half caster. You're not necessarily a super competent fighter without your bag of tricks. But once you start adding all of your special effects that you've built, and you have great flexibility in what you can build, there's 600 upgrades or something. Don't quote me on the exact number, but it's a lot. And since there's no overlap with like DMG magic items, this can fit into most games pretty easily, because you're not getting redundant features or anything like that. If you get magic items, there's still cool magic items you can have, right? They don't overlap with your class features, because all of the upgrades are kind of unique things to the inventor. They're your inventions. And some people look at it and think, wow, there's tons of stuff. But the other thing you'd keep in mind is it's a toolbox for making your character, not a toolbox you get to play. That's the thing I brought up earlier. You only get, usually 4 to 5 of these upgrades. Out of all those hundreds of upgrades, you have as you level up, you get more. But you have, 1 to 9 of them, really. So you are building the path you want to play, but you're not building all of the paths at once. But it has a lot of flexibility. I don't think you can make literally hundreds of characters out of the inventor and not play the same character twice. Even if you look at one of the more specialized subclasses, like the Warsmith, which is the one that's often iconic because it's the fantasy Iron Man-ish one that's very picturesque, right? It's the one that I often use as a header image for it because it's got cool art. Um, but and Fantasy Iron Man is a very popular concept. Let me tell you. If I never attach that name to it, plenty of people do it for me. Um, I don't think I even started calling it that, but so many people called it that I'm like, well, that's what it is now. um, but I mean, you can make light armor with it, right? You don't have to make plate armor. You can make integrated armor, which is making some kind of augmented fellow. You can make, war gear, which is not really armor at all, but it's just kind of various things that you wear that enhance your abilities. Um, and you can attach force blasters to your arm or enhance your muscles to be super strong. But even if you can be stronger than a fighter using that armor, you won't be as competent as a fighter because you're not a fighter. You're just a smart guy wearing fancy armor. And that's what they all want to come back to is whatever you do with your inventor, if you don't have your inventions, you're probably in bad shape because you are the selling point of your character is that you've made all this cool stuff. Now it's easy to replace your cool stuff if you've managed to lose it during your adventures. But you're like a wizard without the spellcasting focus, without the spell book. If you lose it all, because that's where your power comes from. It's all this cool stuff you've made. So
Right. I like that a
that's a
lot.
long answer that might have rambled off a bit. So you're probably getting the theme here where you ask a question, I just go whoop off into the distance, but
It's an
hopefully that
interview.
included an answer.
It's an interview. I ask a question and then you talk. That's how it goes.
Uh,
I really like that. The artificer, as it stands right now, is a little bit underwhelming.
well, so I don't talk too much about the Wizards of the Coast Artificer. They did their own thing, and I think they obviously have a different target demographic than me in some ways, and a wider one. But uh, over time, I think there's been less and less overlap between what I call an artificer or my inventor and what they call one. They have more specific characters in mind for what you're playing, where I have a more toolbox based approach where I don't really have any preconceived ideas of what you're playing as an artificer. I'm just trying to give you ways to invent what you want to play. And if I've done it right, there's enough options that you're not going to you're not going to run into the walls of my toolbox here because there's enough depth that no matter what you think you want to invent, there's going to be some option that's pretty close to that.
Right. So, why don't you tell, speaking of toolboxes and creating things, why don't you tell us a little bit about the crafting systems?
All right. Well, the crafting system dwarfs the rest of this, and those are pretty big classes. So there's a lot there. So the crafting system, again, I think there's this common theme of I didn't set out to make a crafting system, but over time, as soon as I made the artificer and the artificer got popular, people are like, well, obviously this needs a crafting system, and I'm like, well, that'd be great. Someone should make that. uh, but so it's been on my back radar for several years now, really. As I said, I started the artificer about 3 years ago. And I started some idea of the crafting system not too long after that. But to be honest, I scrapped the crafting system several times in that process. This is what we're seeing now is really the third full iteration of the crafting system. But in my first stabs at the crafting system, my conclusion was this is too complicated for me to make. I mean, there's too many pieces to this. It's too big a system. And back in those days, I was only working on homebrew a few hours here and there. And the amount of testing and balancing that's going to a crafting system is extensive. But a couple things happened. One is the audience of my stuff got bigger. I get more and more playtesting on stuff I release. To the point where I get reams of it at this point, which made testing something like this a lot more possible. I can release something, and I will get pages and pages of feedback about if I price breastplates wrong. People are gonna let me know. So that is super helpful to me as a creator, even if feedback can always be a challenging one. But it's necessary to kind of forge something like the crafting system because there's no way I can play my games and make all the stuff in that crafting system myself. And unlike classes where you can do a more focused playtest, it's hard to do a focused playtest on crafting, really. And then the other big, honestly, part of why I'm making crafting is back in the summer, I no longer had a day job. So I suddenly had a lot more time to throw into making D&D content. Um, and that's what the system really needed, was just me to throw hundreds of hours into going through it. So what we have is we have blacksmithing. You can make every item in the book. You can make every sword, every weapon, every armor, and even adventuring gear. The goal is that everything that exists in the game, there's going to be rules to make it. And then the other part of it is that there's going to be a great deal of the underlying framework should be pretty transparent, so that the system is extensible to make things that aren't in it. And for blacksmithing, that's not quite as important for the base items, where it can have a template that covers how to make everything, right? So it actually has real direct ingredients and materials and crafting time and everything for every sword, halberd, etc., all that stuff. But then it also has what's called the weapon template. So if you want to make a brand new weapon that doesn't exist in D&D, you can go through the steps on the weapon template. And that's one of the things that's released for free out there. You can find, Kibbles weapon template or something. And you can look at that to get an idea of if this kind of crafting system will be for you, because that's kind of one of the philosophical starting pieces of this crafting system. Was I made that weapon template a long time before I made the rest of the crafting system. Well, at least I made it probably for the crafting 1.0, really. But then that takes you through making any weapon that you could conceive of that doesn't fall into the default templates. And so that's kind of the two aspects of the crafting system. Is one is, here's how to make everything that exists, and here's how to make everything that doesn't exist. And between that, we've got everything plus covered. So we got blacksmithing, we have alchemy, obviously. That's going to be a huge one. That's one of the most requested ones, because that's near and dear to every adventurer's heart. Is they want their healing potions, they want their flying potions, all that stuff's in there. So again, it covers every SRD potion, which is everything I can do with the open game license. And then to backfill a bunch of the content that I wouldn't be able to use, it makes up a bunch of new potions. And there's going to be various sources for those. I'm not going to go too much into depth of the custom potions you can make. A lot of them are just made by me. Any others might be made by other people with permission to use in the book. I don't know how many of those there's going to be yet. That's still something we're in talks about. But the vast majority of them will probably be made by me, that are potions I use for my games, or potions that present things that a lot of people want to do. Various revamps to like alchemical fire, stuff like that. Alchemical fire is a very popular thing for adventurers to want to use, but I find that they're often disappointed by what exists in the book for it. So this presents alternate versions of what you could use there, as well as much more powerful versions that explode much more horrifically and violently, because that's what adventurers want to do. It has rules for making explosives with alchemy. Knock yourselves out, probably literally, because adventurers should not be trusted with explosives. In my experience, every time I've given explosives to the players, it's gone horribly wrong. I think this is going to be a little bit of a tangent, but in my very first time I was running for, maybe not the first time, but a very early game of 5e I was running Lost Mines of Phandelver, as many people do. And the first mission, they were escorting a mining cart down to the village. And they're like, so what's in there? So I'm like, mining tools, pickaxes, mining explosives. And that sentence, the whole campaign took a hard left turn because they got to that goblin ambush, and they're like, well, there's goblins. They spotted the goblins up ahead, and they're like, instead of fighting those goblins, we're gonna rig this cart to blow. And you can probably imagine how these plans go, but there is now a crater in that road, and that's been a plot point ever since. So I am not, when I make rules for crafting explosives, I'm not endorsing giving them to your players. Do that at your own risk. But I'm just the person that provides the toolbox. And then alchemy, I also wanted to expand like the oil section, how you can buff up your weapons. I want flame tongue oil, stuff like that. And then that comes in a couple basic ones. One is just like oil you dump on your sword and light on fire. That is like 1d4 fire damage. It basically just makes your sword on fire, which is sometimes useful and sometimes cool. And then there's like actual flame tongue oil, which is obviously a much more rare substance, which burns for longer, burns more magically, deals 2d6 fire damage like an actual flame tongue weapon. So it briefly converts your weapon into a flame tongue weapon. Oils are something that exist in the default rules. I just don't find them used too much because I think they tend to be, their rarity is very high, so they rarely show up on tables. And players really don't like using very rare consumable items. So by giving them lower tiers that are more, easy to grade up into, they can really make it more part of their character that they use this sort of stuff. They, find the reagents and they actually make it, and then they actually use it because they have confidence they can get it again. If you give them this as loot, they'll be like, well, this is the only one I'm ever getting, so I'm never going to use it. But if they can actually use it, well, then they're going to be a lot more likely to actually consume these things. So that's blacksmithing, that's alchemy. And then I guess the next biggest one is enchanting. That's probably the biggest one overall. Now, enchanting is a name that some people take objection to because enchanting in D&D has the two meanings of making magic weapons and casting charm spells, which I don't really know how to reconcile the fact that it means those two different things, but it's the best word I have for it, and it's what I've stuck with so far. But in the crafting sense, enchanting means making magic items, which is something that players really want to do. And now there is rules for how you can make magic items in DMG and Xanathar's Guide to Everything. Both of them have their own versions of rules. The problem with these rules is that they expect a certain kind of play, which is to say weeks of downtime, which some people do. Some people have adventures. They go on an adventure, then their characters are waiting around for 2 weeks, and they make some magic items. Very many people don't do that, though. Very many people, they don't assume weeks of downtime and thousands of gold in their adventures, which I think is that. I mean, I don't when I play. Maybe we'll have a few days of downtime, maybe a week, but there's never 5 weeks of downtime where it's like, see you guys all later. We're gonna we're gonna reconvene in a few months. I think that comes from an older style of play, which even by the time I started playing was a little bit out of date, where you'd go on a dungeon quest and then 6 months later you're on another dungeon quest. It was more like, frontier expeditions or something, which some people still do in kind of West March style servers and things like that. But even those these days can be much more compressed in their time frame. So I wanted to make a version of crafting, and this applies to alchemy and blacksmithing as well as enchanting, that wasn't necessarily quick, but integrated better into your adventuring life. I wanted to make it more applicable to adventurers. So I guess this kind of is a whole crafting system thing I probably should have started with, but the crafting system essentially works in 2-hour chunks. Some crafting has to be done in one go, where if it takes 4 hours, you got to do all 4 hours together, like alchemy, because it makes sense that you can't just leave the potion and come back to it. But for ones that take longer, like enchanting, which invariably takes quite a while still, you can do it 2 hours during a long rest, over the course of weeks of adventuring. And so the two things it does aims to compress the crafting time greatly, but then to keep the system gated and not just be free magic items for everyone, it builds in a material system. And then the materials are probably something I should talk about because that's one of the big challenges of a crafting system. My original kind of inclination was that you would give materials that like exotic things like you need a rock feather and 6 herbs from the side of a cliff and stuff like that, which are cool in narrative, but very hard to integrate in your game. As someone that started my games like that, telling my players they needed a rock feather could very much derail the game because now they got to go find a rock and how to get its feather. And that becomes more important to them than whatever the quest was previously. Now the quest is find a rock to get a rock feather so they can get their winged boots. So what I did to kind of make the system something that gives the DM more levers onto the system, as well as lets it integrate into the adventures, is the materials are very much more generic. Now they're not so generic to just say gold pieces, but they're like uncommon arcane essence. And what that is can be a very wide range of things. Now that it's not fully generic, right? There's uncommon divine essences, there's primal essences, there's psionic essences, and then it provides guidelines to what that would be. So, like a rock feather would be probably an uncommon primal essence, because rocks are primal creatures that are from the giants and that sort of thing. Their origins are very much more on the primal side. So, a magical component from them would be a primal component. And that means that maybe you can get by with a dragon tendril wing or something. There basically there's other places to harvest that same equivalent ingredient, and the final thing you make might look different or be themed somewhat different based on the sources of the materials you got, but they all come to the same core template functionality, which ties into every magic item in the SRD and a lot of new magic items. So then on top of that, sometimes you'll need like scrolls and other things that can be generic and extensible again. So like for winged boots, I don't actually have it in front of me, but I'm going to guess you need like a scroll of fly, some uncommon primal essence, uncommon arcane essence, something like that. So you have logical components of the things that if you think about, if I want to make boots to let me fly, what kind of things would I need? And then that's what makes the system extensible, because you can invent a brand new magic item. Well, my creativity on the spot is not super sharp. But let's
Want to
just say
make
you want to
like
make a flaming sword, which unfortunately already exists, but I'm just going to use that as an example. You would need like a scroll of elemental weapon, because you want to, borrow the magic of that kind of magic. Then you need a bunch of primal essences, because fire is pretty primal. And then you need a fancy sword to put all this on, because you can't just enchant a rusty old longsword with magic. Magic has expensive taste. Um, that's why when you see those artifacts, they're always golden ornamented things, because that's how magic works. And that's also one of those things that I play around with a bit. Not everything has that base cost, though some things will have that base cost, where you need a sword worth 1,000 gold to put this magic on. But many things work on just any sword. Kind of provides a bit more texture to the system, where things do have different requirements. But then the requirements are still transparent enough that you can take those and build magic items I don't provide into what you could pretty easily deduce what they should be using the template builders.
right,
Uh,
and this is a very distinctly like player centric system, right? Like the DM isn't adjudicating all of this.
no, so that's really my goal, is that I could get you can give, and that's one of the products I'm offering, is just the crafting handbook, because I think it's really easy just to give that to the players and be like, look, this is your shopping magazine, you tell me. Now it's still gated by the DM in the sense that they have to provide the ability to get a uncommon primal essence or something. You still have to find the materials to an extent, but that means once you give the players the materials, they're in charge of what they want to make with it, and it's really easy to track your progress, that sort of thing of crafting. So it's much more a player-driven DM enabling system is what I would put it. The DM has a great deal of flexibility in what they can enable the players to do, and the players are pretty much turned loose on what they might want to make. And I think the way this works best is to mix this with traditional loot, not entirely replace traditional loot, but give them some traditional loot and some crafting items. That way they'll have some freebie items, which is what the traditional loot is, and then they'll have the crafting items. And for the freebie items they really don't like, there are some ways to salvage part of those for crafting materials. But that's intentionally somewhat inefficient, whereas there's some incentive to use the items you got if you can, or harvest them and salvage them if there's really no use for them. Um, and then there's just a whole bunch of other crafting branches in there for pretty much. I think I've covered every artisan tool. I'm not gonna certify stamp that, but I think I have every artisan tool covered. But not all of them are as flashy as others. There's rules for cooking in there. There's different levels of feasts and rations and snacks and everything. But it's not intended to be balanced against enchanting in the sense that enchanting can make cooler stuff than cooking. Um, but it intended to be something cool for people that want to use cooking. The same with tinkering. There's pretty much every tool. I mean, even cobbling's in there. You want to make fancy boots? I got fancy boots for you. But then those tie into their systems because, like, what if you need a pair of boots that cost 1,000 gold pieces? Well, you can make a fancy pair of boots with cobbling to then enchant with your flying magic. So they all kind of feed into each other where you don't need each system, but there's advantages to having multiple crafters in the party using different systems. And likewise, they tend to focus slightly different stats, like blacksmithing relies on strength, primarily. Now there's variants in there saying your DM can, let you use wisdom or something instead, but it's intentional that each kind of stat has different useful things they can bring to the table. The mental stats are a little bit overrepresented just because intelligence and wisdom are big parts of crafting, where charisma does not come into crafting much, as one might expect. But I think that's also fine because charisma tends to interact with the existing rules of 5e a bit more than wisdom and intelligence tend to. Particularly intelligence is often the dump stat because people are like, I don't. Because I think part of the problem with intelligence, and this is, again, way tangent, is that players often believe the DM is not going to withhold the result of intelligence checks because those are usually the plot and lore the DM wants to dump on you. So players are like, look, I'm going to fail my history check, and you're still going to tell me the history of this because you, the DM, wrote that down, and you don't want to not tell me. So giving more uses to intelligence that players really care about is a great way to bring that stat up in the eyes of players. Like, look, your intelligence is now helping you make a magic sword. So now you as a fighter, you might really want intelligence because if you want to focus on having cool magic gear and you don't have an inventor in your party that can make it for you. Now, if you have an inventor in your party that can make it for you, well, that just makes being an inventor cooler.
Right. I gotta ask, you have a big emphasis on crafting and things from previous editions and like enchanting stuff. Do you have a system for Incarnum in the works from good old 3.5, the magic of Incarnum?
No, I unfortunately do not. I don't specifically. Well, sometimes I do specifically port things. I think it's obvious that I am influenced by previous things. Um, but I tend to do a more when I decide I need something in 5e in particular. That's when I start looking into. So, what are my ideas for this? What are the ideas that previously existed? And I start fusing them all together into something new. Now, if a bunch of people are asking for something, that's when it starts getting on my radar. And I mean, as I said, psionics weren't really on my radar until it became the thing that people were asking for. And so there's a whole endless queue of the various things people have asked for, and the more things people ask for, the higher in that list it starts to go. And that's kind of why I have the warlord is not in this book, but I do have a warlord out there. And that pretty much entirely came from a lot of people like, I really want a warlord, and I'm like, yeah, looks like a warlord is needed in 5e. So people said, I really want a scion. Well, there's a scion in 5e. So basically, it's a combination of two things. If people ask for it, and it's something I kind of think is in my game, then I start making it. So there's definitely going to be more things. I'm not going to say what's all the plans beyond this book, because I already have one of those set of plans set. And I'm trying not to talk about the next book as if there's going to be a next book already. But with the success of this Kickstarter, there certainly might be a next book. But right now, I wanted to take what I knew was the most popular collection of things I had, which was the crafting, the scion, and the inventor, and shove them into one book and say, this is the best stuff I got. And if this does well, then I might have more best stuff in the future.
I certainly hope so, based on this.
Yeah, well, the results of this Kickstarter have probably changed the future. When I set out, I mean, I'm gonna be be honest, behind the scenes here is the 10K goal I set was like, I think I need 10K to make this book. That's my goal. I wasn't aiming for funded in the first 3 hours headlines, which it was, but that was not what I was setting out to do. I was thinking, well, I'm pretty sure I can hit. I have solid I have a solid notion I can hit 10K, and I'm pretty sure I can make this book for 10K. And now it's sailing past 100K, so it's done very well, which means that the amount of time I can spend being a person that makes D&D homebrew has gone up similarly. Well, there's a ratio to it all, but yeah. So there's almost certainly more future plans now. Obviously, it's one step at a time. Deliver this book before I go too crazy about worrying what's in the next book. But yeah, there's definitely more coming.
Excellent. And yeah, that'll be your main other thing is Patreon, right? So that'll mostly be over there for now.
Right. So I tend to release most things I do on Patreon first. Now this is the secrets I shouldn't let out, but I actually release most of the stuff I make for free somewhere. If you follow me, particularly on Reddit, that's where I release most of my stuff. That's kind of the conglomeration of where I release my stuff. If you follow, I'm technically on Twitter, though I am not as active there. I post most things I make on Twitter. Technically, I'm on Instagram now, though. I'm gonna be honest. That's I'm a little fuzzy on that concept. But you can follow me on Reddit or Patreon. Those will get you most of what I do. Typically, Patreon sees the newest stuff I have as well as the most collected stuff I have. Like you can see my blacksmithing posted on Reddit, you can see my enchanting posted on Reddit, you can see my cooking posted on Reddit, but you can see all of those together in one fancy document on Patreon. And for a long time, I think for the first 2-ish years, everything I released was free. I didn't have anything behind the Patreon. But now I do basically have the collections of stuff behind the Patreon. So everything is released individually for free. Like I have a compendium of spells. It has about 80 spells in it. And all those have been released for free somewhere. If you want to delve my Reddit profile, they're all there somewhere. But if you want them all together, well, that's on the $3 tier on my Patreon. So that's kind of the deal I make, I guess, is that my Patreon is the convenient place for things, which helps make me make it. You get to see it a bit earlier. And then if you just want to see more stuff from me, you can follow me on X social media, and it'll probably be there at some point. I also have a Discord these days, which has been very helpful as it's a more direct feedback source where people are more inclined to give you quick feedback and tends to be sometimes a little bit more constructive with Reddit. I actually have relatively positive experiences with feedback on Reddit, though I also have it's an acquired taste. you have to have some degree of navigation of those threads to know, if people write up a 10-page rant, even if some parts of it are not very friendly, you have to parse from that they cared about it for 10 pages. So that's, that's still a win, and you're going to get some good stuff from that. But the Discord and Patreon have also been huge boons as far as getting more feedback. And so those tend to be where the first release of anything are the roughest versions, and then as well as the collections of stuff, and those go on Patreon. But I mean, I also, as speaking of free things I have out, I mean, I do have a Warlord out, I do have an Occultist out. Those are both available on my website for free. So lots of stuff from this book. If you want to see what will be in this book, what's the malleable clay that's going to be built into what is in this book, a lot of that's already been released. And that's how I can make this book. Is that this is not me sitting down to write a 300-page book. This is me collecting 3 years of stuff to put in a 300-page book. Now, there's going to be a lot of work to edit and polish that, because I'm going from a person that posts stuff for at most $1 online to a person that, is making a real book that can't be edited down the road and has to be correct. Folks familiar with my work will tell me that grammar and spelling are not always my natural high stats. So being able to bring in a professional editor was never something I could do with my free content or even my Patreon content because you have to pay editors. But with a full book, it's going to have people that are much better at all of those fancy things about how to word stuff in 5e or how to use the English language. Let's just say that I'm not sure I have proficiency in that one, but we're bringing people with expertise. Um, how to calculate CR correctly. These are things I know how to calculate CR correctly. I just don't usually do it. Um,
It's okay.
but I mean,
Wizards doesn't know how to calculate CR correctly.
well, that's kind of my theory is that I just pick a CR that seems right to me, and it's probably going to be more right than the calculated one. But for the book, we are going to follow all the rules for stuff like that and be very precise, very accurate, very 5e compatible, just to make it look and feel as much like a 5e source book as we can reasonably do, um, which should be pretty. I think that I'm confident in saying it'll be much more polished than my usual content, which is already, I would say, what I tend to do is very balance focused, very mechanics focused, and then polish is the third or fourth or fifth goal. And this will bring those all up to basically all have someone else that cares about polish as much as I care about balance. So with that kind of combination, we should be able to make it quite a solid spot.
Yeah,
But
and
if you want to see the newest raw, where I'm going, what I'm doing, that would be on Patreon.
excellent. And yeah, all the main writing is done. All of the Kickstarter is already funded to a significant degree.
Funded, all
Um,
stretch goals are funded, everything's there.
Even the backstop, make sure we don't run out of stretch goals. Stretch goals.
Yeah, when I put those up, I thought I was pretty safe. I mean, I saw this is sailing upwards, and I'm like, well, look, this might go to 80K. This might go serious places, and then it phew, right past 80K, and I'm like, well, guess I should have been more ambitious with those. But on the other hand, that's kind of the money I think I need to make those things. So I'm not going to put the goal higher just to make the goal higher. Anything that is higher goals from now will be mostly symbolic or celebratory, but I'm not even sure I'm going to have anything higher at this point. The stretch goals are just you get a book.
Stretch goal fever is the death of many a project, unfortunately. So I'm glad to see that you've inoculated yourself against it.
Yeah, I certainly could feel that early on, where as we're sailing past it, because the goals up to 30K were the goals that I had when I started the book. Those are things that I wanted to do, but ended up on the cutting room floor. They required too much art for my budget for the book. So those are things like, well, first thing we sweep the cutting room floor and we put those all back in. And then when I ran out of those, I'm like, well, I have a shopping list pages long, but in the attempting to just start throwing them things in there. But as I talked to some people, as I kind of grounded myself back into reality of that this has to be a physical book that actually has to exist. I cleaned things up, stretched out the existing stretch goals to realize that, if we're gonna have these lost era items or something, I could make pages and pages of those. Or the monster section. Rather than adding new sections, I'd rather just expand those sections a bit more as I get more funding. And that's what the penultimate stretch goal, 90K was that, you know, everyone told me 250 or 100, I wanted to stay under 300 pages. 230 was the original goal for the book. But as we hit 90K, I'm like, well, we'll go up to 300 because essentially my cost per book goes up, but the more books I'm selling, my cost per book goes down. So it's just me essentially giving back the discount I'm making from the volume. But that'll also let me just make more of everything. Various, monsters that I weren't sure going to make it in, various items, expanded crafting branches, stuff like that. Those can all start making their way back into the book. Because 300 pages, that's going to be essentially another player's handbook. That's a lot of new content. But I'm also confident that I have more than enough to fill that. So
Got to put a bookbinding crafting tree in there. Acquiring uncommon Kickstarter essences and all that stuff.
Well, crowdfunding in Faerun might be a hard one.
Well, I think that wraps up all my questions. Do you have anything else you want to bring up, Kibbles?
No, I think I've rambled on quite a few tangents today and have covered in depth, probably in too much depth, certain pieces of it. And I'm sure there's parts where I'll look back and say, wow, I really should have talked about that. But what they are, I have no idea right now. I'm not even entirely sure what I've covered in the last hour. So it has cool stuff. It has crafting. It has psionics. It has an inventor. That's what you need to know.
All right. Well, thank you very much for coming on, Kibbles. It's been a joy to talk to you. Uh,
Thank you for having me. I know that scheduling this was a bit of a challenge because my feel like I've been in the headlights ever since I hit the go button. But thank you for your patience and continuing to reach out to me and getting this arranged. So thank you very much for that.
I am persistent, if nothing else.
I very much appreciate that persistence in this case, because things have been going in one ear and out the other for a little bit right now. I did not. No one told me that when I started a Kickstarter, I'd be getting like 50 emails a day or more, and did not have the appropriate proficiencies for that.
Well, and for everybody watching at home, there are links to the Patreon and the Kickstarter below. Both, both Kibbles' Patreon and also mine, I guess technically. Back both of them, please. Uh,
More of them.
more. Uh, and yeah, have a good night, everybody.
All right. Thank you.